Hello and welcome to Matcha Mornings, part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith, and I'm excited to dive deep on topics around holistic health, the power of food, hormone health, how the practices of yoga can impact our health and well-being, and much more. So grab your cup of tea, settle in, and let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Matcha Mornings podcast. I am very excited that you've decided to join me for today's episode of the show. Today on the podcast, we have a really exciting guest. I am joined by Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. Lisa is a certified fertility awareness educator, a holistic reproductive health practitioner, and the author of The Fifth Vital Sign, Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. Lisa helps health-conscious women discover the connection between their menstrual cycles and their overall health so they can ditch hormonal birth control forever. Our education system has failed to teach us about our fertility, so Lisa is there to empower you to take control of your fertility and your life. And if you know anything about my story or you've listened to other episodes of this show, you probably know that I was pretty stoked to talk to Lisa. If you've listened to the podcast at all, or you've heard a little bit about my story, then you know that coming off birth control led me to lose my period for 2 years, and it's been probably like 8-9 years of me just naturally trying to heal my body and get into the rhythm of my monthly cycles. And although I'm healthy and have a regular cycle now, it did take a long time, a lot of work, and a lot of research. So on this episode of the podcast, Lisa and I dive into her health and wellness story, how she became passionate about hormones and holistic health, as well as menstrual cycles. And then we dive into a little bit about birth control, as well as what fertility awareness is and how to get started with it. So if this is the first time you're hearing of fertility awareness or tracking your cycles naturally, there is lots of good stuff in here to help you get started with your own natural tracking. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. And without further ado, here's the interview. Lisa, welcome to the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you here with me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And where are you joining me from today?
I'm just outside of Toronto.
Oh, awesome. That's great. Fellow Canadian. So I guess I know all about Canadian winter. I'm not there right now, but I know all about it. So I hope you're staying warm and well with all the craziness going on right now.
Yes. I mean, fortunately, it's been pretty mild and we don't have a lot of snow. That's good and bad. I have kids, so the snow is actually good for the tobogganing aspect, but yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel that. I was never bothered by winter as a child. And then as an adult, I was like, no, I'm not into it. And I don't have kids yet. So maybe that's part of it. But I'm so excited for this conversation. You have so much good stuff on the go and just feel very aligned with your work and your mission. And I want to start with just a little bit about your story. Can you talk a little bit about your story with health and wellness and hormones and all that good stuff?
Yes. So, I mean, it's interesting how things come about, like I wouldn't have been able to guess that this is what I would have been doing, but then looking back, it kind of makes perfect sense. So when I had my first period for those first couple of years, it was immediately like super painful and really heavy and kind of hard to manage for a teenager. And being that I didn't really know anything and how to handle it, certainly I went to the doctor wanting a prescription for the pill because, of course, I had heard that the pill makes your, air quotes, periods lighter and easier to manage. So I did that and it was like magic. I took the pill and I wasn't sexually active, but the periods that I had on it, if you want to call it that, were lighter and easier to manage. And so, being like 15, 16, I kind of thought, okay, I'm fixed now. So every now and then I would kind of come off of the pill thinking that things would be better. And every time I did that, my actual periods would come back and they would be just as bad. So the reason that I share this is because, I kind of did the opposite of what a lot of young women do when you actually become sexually active and need protection. So I went off the pill and it was in part because I had the sense that something was wrong and I didn't really know how to put it into words, but I just didn't feel like it should be like that. Like I didn't feel like I should be doubled over in pain on the floor, needing Advil, without which I couldn't function, And I was concerned that if there were my mother and my aunties and, a few of my cousins and things like that have struggled with fibroids and a variety of other challenges, with regards to the, reproduction and stuff like that. And so I had this feeling of, I don't know what's wrong, but I don't think the pill is fixing it because every time I go off of it, it's the same. So even though I didn't have the language, I knew that it wasn't really doing anything, because if it was, then I wouldn't always need it in order to fix it. So I come off the pill when I actually need protection. I decided I was going to use condoms, and it was right around that time that I discovered fertility awareness. And so that was a huge revelation, that I'm not fertile every day, and that I could actually monitor my cycles, monitor my cervical fluid, cervical position, basal body temperature, and actually know what's going on and use that as a way to avoid pregnancy in combination with the condoms that I had been planning to use. And so that kind of started me off on my journey. And throughout the years, charting allowed me to identify some health issues. Like I had a hypothyroid issue that was identified pretty early on through my charting. And I took a training program pretty early on as well. And that allowed me to see beyond just the birth control, just the practical aspects, and understand the cyclism of as a vital sign. And then later on, becoming a mother, and I guess just kind of poking my head into the sand and looking around and realizing that even though I had been able to use this method and have this knowledge throughout my 20s, most women still don't know that they're not fertile every day, for starters, and how their cycle works. So that's essentially the long and short of how I came into doing the work that I do.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I feel like very connected with that story because it's sort of similar to mine. Like I went on to birth control when I was, I think 15, and it was because I was having really heavy irregular periods. And then, I had my first boyfriend, shortly after that, and we became sexually active. And so it was, handy to be on the pill because then I didn't have to have any uncomfortable conversations with my parents and that type of thing. And then I just stayed on birth control until I think I was around 22 or 23. And I just felt like I was crazy on it. Like I just felt like there would be times in my cycle where it wasn't me controlling my emotions and my actions and things I was saying. Like it was like I was an outsider kind of watching these things happening. And I was just, something in me was like, I need to get off of this. And then I had this crazy experience of not actually getting my period for 2 years after being off of it. And when I was going to my doctor, like my regular family doctor, he was like, well, if you're not trying to get pregnant right now, you should just go back on the pill. Like everything was working fine. And I was like, well, clearly it was not. Like if I was crazy on it and then I come off of it and now my body's not functioning the way it's designed to function, like clearly everything's not working. It was so obvious to me at that time, even though I wasn't really, this was kind of the start of my own health and wellness journey. And I just feel like there was this gut instinct that it just wasn't right. And I've just stayed off birth control since then and worked, similar to what you're talking about with fertility awareness and natural family planning, tracking my cycle. And it's so interesting to me how with young women, we're not really teaching them to be connected to their bodies and to be connected to their cycles and this like beautiful aspect that we have as women. Instead, it's like, oh, here's this pill that will make things, less painful, less uncomfortable, and make sure that you don't get pregnant. It's kind of this interesting thing we have going on in society from my perspective. What are your sort of thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, it's basically, kind of the opposite of what we need. It's not to say that the pill doesn't have its place and it can't be helpful as part of the journey, obviously. So I come across as, I think, really anti-pill sometimes, given that I talk about the side effects openly, all that kind of stuff. And, I have a whole series on my podcast about interviewing women who have had different experiences with birth control. I think obviously one of the big problems is just the lack of basic education. And so if you think about what it was like when you were in, high school and you learned, I remember biology class, and I learned a whole lot about my eyes and ears, and they are important, but it's your reproductive system that builds your family. And that's pretty important. And the fact that we don't even have the basic understanding of, the full breadth of the cycle, like what happens in between periods, the role of cervical fluid, the fertile window, the fact that we're not fertile every day, just how it all works, that very basic knowledge to me, it just feels irresponsible. And the pill then is kind of given to us in lieu of any type of education. And again, many women find relief from symptoms with the pill, but in your experience and my experience, even though if you have irregular cycles and you go on the pill, it forces a bleed every 28 days, in most women. But that is not a cycle. And most women don't know that. And so like you discovered and I discovered, being on the pill makes everything look perfect on paper. And then when you come off of it, you have to deal with what's really going on. And so certainly I agree with you that our culture I think that a good start would just be to educate young women about the basics of the cycle. And I'm done with waiting for the government or the education system, the schools or whatever to do that. And that's why I just started talking about it, and I wrote a book about it, and just kind of doing my part to try to get it out there. Because ultimately, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Like if we wait for the government to decide that menstrual cycles are important, we'll just keep waiting.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I'm so glad that you are talking about this and that you've created resources for people, because you're totally right. Like if we just wait for this to become something that is, I guess, like acknowledged by the government or acknowledged by, all of general practitioners. And I don't want to say like that some aren't talking about it, because there are great doctors out there that are working with women on this, both male and female. And there are people doing really excellent work in this field. It's just kind of like the majority of people, I think, are looking for this quick fix. And it's, I think for a young person too, who doesn't want to get pregnant and maybe finds like their cycle or they're having their period is a bit of an inconvenience. I mean, the pill sounds like this really magical thing. Like that's how I remember feeling. And I can kind of connect back into that, like being young and being like, okay, this thing will make sure that I don't get pregnant. It's going to make it so that I have this cycle regularly, that I know when I'm going to bleed. Oh, I can even skip it if I want. That was like something that I loved, especially in my early 20s. Like, oh, I have an event coming up or something. I don't want cramps. I don't want to have to worry about changing tampons. I'll just skip my period. And nobody ever told me like, that's a bad idea. Like you shouldn't do that. That's not going to help you in the long run when you come off of this thing. And there was just no education that I was aware of, and nobody to really talk to about it. I mean, even like my mom didn't really know, like, hey, you probably shouldn't do this. And I think that the education piece and empowering, young women, I guess women of all ages, is a really important aspect of it.
Well, I think that's an interesting point to kind of flesh out a little bit, because, for example, if you're on the pill, what's really interesting. So when I was researching for the book, I got this book, and I think it's called Your Fertility Doctor. And it basically goes through the history of the birth control pill. So it's kind of like it tells you the story of kind of what was going on around that time. And what's interesting is that, so the pill came out, the first pill, Enovid, came out in 1960. And the way that it kind of came about in a way was, or before it came out, I guess you could say, the makers of the pill did what I would call, a beta trial. They did the beta version. And in the first iteration of the pill, there was no bleed. So what happened was they had a group of women, and some of the women were actually trying to get pregnant. And so there was this idea that if you were to kind of put them on the pill and suspend the cycle, they still do this, today, that it would somehow trigger the real cycle to start. So anyway, so you have a group of women, some of whom are actually trying to avoid pregnancy or trying to get pregnant. And you have, others who are wanting birth control, and they put them on this pill with no pill bleed. So it's just like a continuous pill. And so the women go on this pill and they take it every day, and then they lose their periods. But this is like in the late 50s when there was no pill. And the only time that a woman would stop having her period was when she was either pregnant or breastfeeding or legitimately, ill, if there was a health issue. So these women thought they were pregnant. And so what happens is, they go on this thing, they stop getting their periods. And of course, they're like, oh, I must be pregnant. And the first iteration of the pill was a much heavier dose. Like dangerously heavier. So many of the women also had some other kind of effects that might have made them think that they were pregnant even more so. And so anyways, the doctors are trying to tell these women that you're not pregnant, and they're not getting it because they're really excited and happy, some of them, because they were actually trying to get pregnant. And when it became clear to these women that it was actually the effects of this drug and they were not pregnant, and that was why they weren't getting their periods, many of them were actually quite devastated because, like I said, it was a mix of women who were trying to get pregnant and not. So my purpose of sharing the story is that there is actually, it's controversial, I suppose, to say, but there is actually no medical reason to have a bleed when you're on the pill. I'm not advocating for it. I'm not saying it's good or healthy. So let me just put that out there. But I'm saying that there's no medical reason to have it because the pill takes away your cycle. So when you're on the pill, you don't have a period. The pill stops you from ovulating in most cases. And so there's no cycle. And when there's no cycle and no ovulation, there is no true menstrual bleed. So what the researchers did to deal with this problem is they introduced the pill bleed. So their beta test resulted in, I think initially it was like a 4-day sugar pill situation. And so that is the start of the pill. And also they chose 28 days so that it would mimic the cycle. So women would think they were still having one. They could have chose any duration, 35 days. It could have shows 120 days. And we see that now because now there are brands like Seasonal that, you bleed 4 times a year. And the only reason they can do that now is because now women are much more comfortable and used to the idea of having something kind of manipulate their cycles and having something that can stop them from bleeding altogether. So it's kind of a tangent, but I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about that. I mean, I don't think it's healthy just to take the pill and never have a bleed. And I think a lot of people are kind of like, oh, aren't you supposed to bleed? But then from that perspective, they never did that for a medical reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. It is really interesting. I think it's something, I mean, I didn't know that until years after I was off the pill and I was dealing with this, like I was confused why I didn't have a cycle when I was getting off the pill. And I was working with my doctor and then my naturopath, and my naturopath's like, well, birth control doesn't actually allow you to cycle. So it's kind of like your ovaries have been sleeping for like 8 years and we got to get them to like wake up. We got to get them to like start firing again and fire signals to your hypothalamus and get your hormones talking and working in a really natural way. And I had no idea. I had figured like, oh, I had this really regular period happening when I was on birth control. So I come off and it should just do it on its own. Right. And I had no idea that like, oh, this was kind of just manipulating my system in this big way. And I think a lot of people are very similar to that. Like they think that because they're bleeding every 28 to 35 days while they're on the pill, that's like how their cycle would just be. And they don't understand that it's like, they're not actually cycling the way that we're naturally, I guess, meant to cycle.
Well, I mean, that's what they're told. When you have a quote irregular period and you go to the doctor, they say, we're going to give you the pill to regulate your cycle. So the language that they use is very much that this is fixing it, that you're still cycling. And it's a pretty significant white lie. And again, the first group of women who got the true kind of out of the beta version, when they added in this pill bleed, they were also fed the same white lie that, and that's so they created it to perpetuate, like the reason that it's the medication is designed the way that it is to mimic your real cycle. So you think you're still having one. So of course, everyone's going to think that they have a cycle. And you bring up a really important point because there's a lot of other kind of white lies that women believe about the pill. So one is that it regulates the cycle. 2 is that it like fixes the cycle. So it's like, if I were to buy like a summer house, by the lake or something like that, and I buy the place and then there's like I didn't realize, but there's like a huge issues with my plumbing or something. So let's say I've got like a giant hole in my plumbing and like literally water is just spouting out everywhere. So what the pill does in that scenario is shut off the water. So then, wow, no more water leakage. But like, but when you turn the water back on, like you still have the water spouting out everywhere because you didn't fix the hole. And I feel like that's really helpful to keep in mind. So yes, the pill basically like, and you know how you've, I think we've all heard like, oh, the pills, like it tricks your body into thinking that you're pregnant. And that's why you don't get pregnant because your body thinks it's already pregnant. And it's like, no, no, when you're pregnant, you produce, very significant levels of estrogen and progesterone more than 10 times. By the time you're 40 weeks pregnant, you're making more than 10 times what you do during your cycle. And it puts your body into, it's kind of like it's not a puberty, but it's kind of like a second phase like that. You know how puberty transforms your body from a child to a woman? Pregnancy transforms your body so that you can make milk and that you can make a human. And so, no, the pill does not mimic pregnancy. It more closely mimics menopause because, like you said, it puts your ovaries to sleep and makes it essentially just kind of shuts everything down. So the one point that I think is important is that when I say that there's no medical reason to, when they made the pill to force a bleed, I'm not saying that there's no medical reason to have a true menstrual period. And I think it's really interesting because you can actually look up menstrual suppression and there's plenty of doctors and different practitioners that talk about it and talk about how it's a good thing and women shouldn't have periods and women in the olden days were pregnant all the time so they didn't have as many periods. Like there's this whole thing. So if you didn't know, there's like this whole like line of thinking along these lines. And I think that they're confusing the pill bleed with the actual true menstrual period. Our bodies were designed to have menstrual periods. They're a sign of health. So a woman of reproductive age, she should be menstruating consistently. Her cycles should be falling in normal range. And when they're not, it's a sign of an issue. So you mentioned that you had the experience of not bleeding for 2 years. Well, if you stop ovulating and menstruating, see, it's a huge sign that there's something off. It can mean about, in the case of hypothalamic amenorrhea, it can mean that you're not getting enough to eat and there's a combination of undernutrition, overexercise, and stress. And it can indicate other serious health issues. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And one thing I'd love to touch on is the IUD, because I feel like that's kind of the thing I'm hearing more and more about these days. Like lots of friends are, oh, well, I got off birth control and now I'm on the IUD. It's more natural. What are kind of your thoughts around people who like switching from the pill to the IUD?
Well, the first thing, there's two different general categories of IUD. So the hormonal one and the non-hormonal one. So there's a lot of interesting myths about the non-hormonal IUD that I've heard people, their practitioners will tell them. And my personal favorite is, the IUD, it's localized and it just has a small amount of hormone. So it's kind of like they're saying that when you put a hormonal IUD inside of your uterus, the hormones all just stay there, as if we don't have like a circulatory system. If I put lotion on my skin and that lotion has chemicals in it, my bloodstream, absorbs that and takes it all through my body. So that's a strange thing that I'll just say right off the bat. So if you have a hormonal IUD, it is hormonal, similar to birth control. One of, in some cases, it can be kind of a benefit, or one of the differences is that the hormonal IUD is infused with synthetic progestin only. So it's not giving you progestin and synthetic estrogen as well. And so there are some women who respond particularly negative to synthetic estrogens. And so some women may find some relief, right, with the progestin only option. With that said, plenty of women have moderate to significant side effects with the hormonal IUD because it is still hormonal. So even though they say it's low dose and central and all that kind of stuff, like it doesn't leave the uterus, which is not true, it does go through your circulatory system, and the hormones infused in the progestin releasing IUDs, it still has to be enough hormone to suppress, to prevent you from getting pregnant, basically. So one of the benefits, I would say, of the hormonal potential benefits is that some women do continue ovulating. So I would say when women have the hormonal IUD, the primary mode of action with the hormonal IUD, so it's releasing the progestin, is that it prevents the uterine lining from fully developing, so that it's not thick enough to support growing of a fertilized egg. And also it closes the cervix, which is the entrance to the uterus, with a thick mucus plug. And so the sperm theoretically can't get in. So that is basically the mode of action. And so some women will use the hormonal IUD. It's very common that women will have bleeding with it. So some women will have random bleeding for, usually like the first 6 months. And then eventually for some, it tapers off. And then, so some women have kind of bleeding a lot. And so that's obviously not what they want. So some women are really going to dislike that. For some women, the bleeding all the time will kind of go away and they'll just not bleed at all. Some women will actually bleed kind of regularly. So some women continue ovulating and having bleeding, having their periods. And, and this can change. So it can be one way at the beginning and it can kind of change later on. So that's something just to keep in mind. And I would just say that because it's hormonal, there are many women who still have emotional side effects and sexual side effects and just not a good experience with it. But again, it just depends on how your body reacts to it. So then you have the non-hormonal, so the copper IUD. And so I would say with the copper IUD, it's one of those things where if it works for you, it can be amazing. There's a few things to be aware of. And one thing I always think is important to say out loud is that if you're thinking about getting an IUD, I would say that it's important to know that the insertion can be extremely painful, excruciating. And this is something that I was always afraid of having anything inserted into my uterus, personally, but I've interviewed many, many women and had many clients who've had IUDs. And one of the things that I did not expect was how many of them tell me how excruciatingly, horrifically painful the insertion was. So not every single woman says that, but it's enough that we should be aware of it. So if you're thinking about getting an IUD, just know that you can actually ask your practitioner to numb the area. So know that that's an option, because it doesn't seem like many practitioners offer that. And even if you ask for it, many practitioners might downplay the potential, especially if you've never had children. So if there's never ever been anything, if your cervix has never been dilated for any reason, then okay. So that's like public service announcement. So with the copper IUD, the benefits of it are that it's non-hormonal, obviously. So because there's no hormones, you just keep having your menstrual cycle. So you continue ovulating and you continue having your period. Whereas with the hormonal infused IUD, some women will and some women won't, and some women will have it sporadically where it's not like regular. And how it works, the primary mode of action is that the copper IUD causes some degree of inflammation inside the uterus, making the uterine lining not receptive to the fertilized egg. And the copper itself has some degree of spermicidal activity. So the copper itself is killing the sperm, and the inflammation that is caused then in the uterine lining prevents the egg from being able to implant. So for some women, that's not going to be okay, because there is a potential that the sperm could meet the egg and then it's, not implanting, and everyone's different with respect to their beliefs around that. The possible downsides of the copper IUD, if you have heavy or painful periods, it's really important to know that because the IUD causes that bit of inflammation, that it can make the periods heavier and it can increase your cramping. So if you have bad periods and they're really painful, you don't want to, it's probably not, I wouldn't recommend it, because it does. If you have pretty easy periods, kind of laissez-faire, everything's great, it may make it a little bit heavier, it may increase the cramping a little bit, but if your periods are kind of like a non-issue, then you're probably a good candidate. And one other unexpected side effect that I've heard women talk about is you would think that if you have cramping with it, it would be during your period. But I've had a number of women talk to me about random cramping and random pain throughout the cycle. So, and then there are potential issues with a foreign body in your uterus with infections. So bacterial infections, like the actual IUD, causing infections and things like that. So I'm not anti-IUD at all, but I'm certainly obviously going through like all the different side effects that I'm aware of, because I think it's important to make an informed choice. And we should step away from this idea that like, if we tell women about the side effects, they're not going to want to use it. I think it's much better to know in advance so that you can make that choice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm definitely on board with that. I feel like if there's a side effect that might make me not want to use a product, I probably want to know about that beforehand and not just turn a blind eye to it. And I feel kind of personally the same just about when I've heard like, oh, well, there's no side effects of having this thing in your uterus. I'm like, it's like a piece of like metal in like some of my softest, most delicate tissues. Like, I don't know. Something about it just makes me feel weird. Oh, really?
Yeah. So that's a thing as well. I mean, I would say that if you want to know about something, sometimes you have to search kind of those opposite things. So if you go to your internet browser and search like copper IUD side effects, and go to whatever social media platform that you like and see if you can find some groups. Those are that's where you hear the real deal. So if you find a group of women who've used IUDs before, whether it's copper or progestin induced, you'll hear it all. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So again, not every woman has a negative experience, but you learn a lot by looking at the stories of the women who did have a bad experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a great piece of advice. Hey everyone, we're just taking a quick break from the show to talk about Energy Bits. Energy Bits are spirulina tablets made of one ingredient, algae. Nothing added, nothing subtracted, just 100% plant-based algae nutrition. No sugar, no caffeine, no gluten, no soy, no additives, no GMOs, no preservatives, no binders, nothing artificial. Just 100% algae, 100% green, 100% healthy, and 100% pure. Pure and simple, the way food should be. They have high protein, high beta carotene, high iron, high chlorophyll, high antioxidants, and over 40 plus vitamins, including the B vitamins. They have electrolytes, including magnesium, potassium, and are a great source of essential fatty acids. Honestly, I could go on and on and on about how great Energy Bits are for you, and that's why I've decided to partner with them. If you want to learn more about Energy Bits or order some yourself, you can head on over to energybits.com to learn more. Use the code WANDERBARN to get 20% off your order. Once again, that's energybits.com and use the code WANDERBARN for 20% off your order. All right, back to the episode. And so maybe we can shift into talking about fertility awareness, because I know that that's something that's what I use in my life. Is that still what you're using personally?
It is. And it's like going on 20 years. So other than my two children, I have a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. And so there obviously was a period of my life there, a fairly short period where we were, using it for contraception, or for conception. So kind of switching it up. And then, postpartum and things like that. But yeah, it's been my primary method of birth control for basically since my 20s, and I'm in my late 30s now.
Amazing. That's so inspiring to hear. I think I went off birth control in early 2012. So I think I'm on like 9 years now, and feel amazing at this point. But I'm curious if we can dive into what fertility awareness is. And then for people who are maybe feeling like, okay, I'm ready to make the shift into getting off birth control, or they're wanting to dive deeper into this, maybe we can talk a little bit about like how you actually do that.
Yeah, for sure. So fertility awareness, basically, from a kind of higher level viewpoint, just a basic understanding of it, it's really understanding your cycle and understanding at what point of your cycle is fertile and what point is not. And I think one of the first things that happens when women dive into fertility awareness is that they kind of unlearn a lot of the myths that they learned growing up. So the most common myths being that you're fertile every single day, that there are no safe days, and it kind of leaves it all as a mystery. So the main 3 signs that you pay attention to with fertility awareness charting are cervical fluid. And so cervical fluid can look like lotion, like white lotion, hand lotion. It can look like clear, raw egg whites. Like if you imagine an egg white and you can kind of stretch it between your fingers and it forms like a thread or something like that. So if you, in a typical healthy cycle, you would have your period for anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. And then you would have a few days before you actually start to see cervical fluid. We call those your dry days. And then as you approach ovulation, you would expect to have anywhere between 2 to 7 days of cervical fluid. So again, the lotiony hand lotion stuff or the clear, raw, stretchy kind of raw egg white kind of situation. And then what happens is you ovulate in a typical healthy cycle. So you have mucus for several days ending in ovulation. And then once you ovulate, the mucus dries up and goes away. So then you have about 12 to 14 days after ovulation where you wouldn't typically observe mucus in a healthy cycle. So once you start to understand how the cycle works, the time in your cycle when you're fertile are those days leading up to ovulation when you see cervical fluid. And there are actually points in your menstrual cycle where your cervix is closed, you're not making cervical fluid, your vagina is really acidic and it actually kills sperm. So there are times in your cycle where it's impossible to conceive. And so in addition to the cervical fluid, so the basal body temperature is a really helpful sign. And what that is you take your temperature every day, first thing in the morning when you get out of bed, before you get out of bed. And what that measures is your resting metabolism. And so this was something that was really exciting to me when I first learned to chart. Because what happens is you take your temperature every morning, and after you ovulate, you produce significant progesterone, and that causes a thermogenic effect in the body. So it raises your resting metabolism. And so you can actually chart it and see it. So any woman who's charting already knows this. But if you've never done it before, or this is new to you, you can, put your daily morning temperatures on your charting app or, in a paper chart if that's your thing. And then after ovulation, you can actually see this shift in temperature. So your temperatures rise and stay high. So it's like a science experiment featuring you. And after 2 decades of charting, I can tell you that it's very consistent. It's very scientific. It's an indirect way of measuring what's happening hormonally in your body, and it also, if you're avoiding pregnancy, it signifies this shift from the period in your cycle where you can conceive to the period of your cycle where you can't. I work with clients, all the time, and even though it theoretically, it's always really a big challenge for my clients to kind of shift from the programming, right? So pretty much all of us go to school and we learn that there's no safe days and we can get pregnant all the time and we're terrified. And so we go on the pill because we're just, and even coming off the pill, the thought of coming off the pill is the most terrifying thing because you've been so programmed to believe that you'll just get pregnant. It's like, if he looks at me, I'll get pregnant. Don't look at me. Look over there. And so, yeah, it can be a bit of a stretch initially to get your head around the fact that there are actually days in your cycle where pregnancy is impossible and you can actually learn to use it. And it's not the rhythm method. So, for anyone who's heard about, the rhythm method is a calendar method, and it's an actual method, but basically you track 6 or more cycles and then you pay attention to the date of ovulation and you calculate, your fertile window. And so that's not effective because you're not basing it on daily observations. And fertility awareness is based on daily observations. And when used correctly, studies have shown that it's up to 99% effective, which I think is really surprising to people because you wouldn't think that a non-hormonal method of tracking your cycle and understanding the fertile window and all those things, you wouldn't think that it could be as effective as hormonal contraceptives. I think for a lot of women who I've spoken to over the years, especially women who've had negative effects with the pill or other types of birth control, I've spoken to so many women who got to the point where they just felt like they had no choice. Like many women who, like yourself, were feeling crazy on the pill, feeling like it was like up and down with the emotions, causing depression or anxiety, even causing low libido and, sexual problems. But feeling like there's nothing else I can do. Like, this is what I have to do. Or if I'm not on the pill, I'm not being responsible, or I can't prevent pregnancy without it. And so coming off the soapbox, I would just say that learning about fertility awareness, it's certainly not for everybody. I don't think every woman on earth is going to use fertility awareness. That's why we have so many options for birth control. But there are women for whom this option is the greatest thing ever. Like they cannot be on hormones. They can track their cycles, learn about the connection between their cycles and health, and experience the empowerment that comes with that. but they can also avoid pregnancy, really learn how to do this. It's really empowering for women who gravitate to this to be able to figure this out. And basically in your house with your own body, you can prevent pregnancy effectively without having to rely on doctors and drugs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. Thanks for going through all of that. And I think too, like something for me that's been really helpful is just as I was going through this imbalance with my hormones, being able to like track things and, just kind of watch the way my body was going and it helped me kind of like move through that process in a way that I think if I was like on a medication or a pill or something like that, I wouldn't have been able to do. And it also got me like very much in touch with my body, like to the point of like, okay, I feel this morning or this is happening, that means I must be like moving into this part of my cycle. And now that my cycle is more regular, it's a lot easier, obviously, to keep track of everything because I know like, when my period's going to come and when I'm ovulating and stuff like that. But I found that when everything was kind of all over the place and I didn't know if my cycle was going to be like 21 days or 30 days or 35 days, that type of thing, that's when it was so helpful to kind of like watch the flow that my body was going through.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of women come to fertility awareness charting for the practical aspect. So whether you're looking for a non-hormonal birth control option or whether you're looking for understanding how your cycle works to improve your chances of getting pregnant, I think a lot of women find fertility awareness at those times. But then when you start charting, so the reason that I always refer to the menstrual cycle as a vital sign is because it literally is. So a vital sign is a measure of how your body's functioning that responds in real time to things that are happening. So if you think about your temperature, if you have a fever, then it tells you something about what's happening in your body right now, and in addition to that, it gives you a sense of like what could be happening. So it kind of narrows it down. So there's a different reason why you might have a fever versus high blood pressure or something like that. And so in the same way, fertility awareness can provide a bit of a roadmap. So I find for a lot of my clients, it's really when they start charting, it's just really eye-opening. So if you are not necessarily taking care of yourself, like if you're super busy with work, you're skipping meals, you're not getting enough sleep, you're eating, crap, whatever the case is, and you start to make some changes, maybe you start to, sleep a little bit better, you start to manage some of the stress, or, maybe you even switch to a different department at work. So things aren't as stressful. Anyways, the point is that when you're charting, you can actually see how those things affect your cycles in real time. And that, I think, for a lot of women gives us that little push that we needed to focus a little bit more on ourselves and take a little bit better care of ourselves. So it's a lot more profound, I think, once you start doing it. Like you come to it for the practical, but then it really gives you a much deeper insight into what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I think too, you just took me right back to like my early 20s, like working in corporate, like sustaining off coffee, not sleeping enough, like not feeling super connected to my boyfriend at the time, now husband, working a job that was stressful, that I didn't feel super, I guess, like in love with. I wasn't very passionate about what I was doing. I was like, constantly dieting, exercising a lot. And it's like, no wonder my cycle wasn't super healthy at that point. And yeah, I think for anyone listening, if you're kind of, maybe experiencing this, it's like little baby steps with this can be really helpful. Like every little thing you do to kind of help your health, helps your cycle as well. And I'm curious if you have any tips, Lisa, for how to get started with fertility awareness, how to start tracking, especially for somebody who's maybe like completely new to this type of method.
Yeah, I mean, so if you're listening and you're on birth control, I would say, certainly it is possible to kind of go through the motions when you're on birth control, but you wouldn't see cervical fluid, you wouldn't see a shift in your temperature. So, but certainly, it would be a good opportunity to to really just jump in and start learning. So I'd say the first step is to start educating yourself about fertility awareness charting. And so, my podcast, I've been doing it for I think I'm in the 7th year now. So I think I'm releasing the 350th episode pretty soon here. So,
wow, congrats.
That's, thanks. It's crazy that there are that many. It's a lot of hours of my voice. But for women who are thinking of charting and they're just at the beginning of their journey, there's a few series that can be helpful. I have a pill reality series and I have a fertility awareness method reality series, meaning, and in that series, I'm interviewing actual clients of mine who have transitioned off birth control or they've started using fertility awareness. And so, what better way to jump in than to listen to the stories of real women who are also doing this. So I would say that's a good place to start. My book, The Fifth Vital Sign, Taking Charge of Your Fertility, those two resources have tons of information about charting and how it relates to your health and just how to get started. So I'd say the first step is kind of educating yourself, just reading and listening. And when you're ready to start charting, so if you're actually wanting to use fertility awareness for birth control, if you're coming off of hormonal contraceptives, then it is important to know that if you're learning on your own through books and different resources, then I would suggest a minimum of 3 to 6 months of charting your cycle before you actually start using the method for birth control. So make sure that if you're coming off of hormonal contraceptives that you have a backup non-hormonal method. So like condoms or something, diaphragm, cervical cap. So something that you are comfortable with, so that you can actually take your time, chart for at least 3 to 6 cycles so that you can really feel comfortable and confident with how it all works before you start to rely on it for birth control. And you can shorten up that time if you work with an instructor. So then if you're working with an instructor, my recommendation would be 1 to 3 full cycles with an instructor before you start actually relying on the method for contraception.
Okay, amazing. And so basically, we'll put links to the podcast. It's Fertility Friday Radio. I actually just subscribed. I'm really excited to dive in. And then people can start tracking things like their body temperature, their cervical fluid, and that type of thing. And then you said kind of 3 to 6 months of tracking before you're using it as like birth control if you don't want to get pregnant. So get to know your cycle a little bit.
Yes. And I would say 3 to 6 cycles. It's like a nitpicky thing, but, for some women, they come off of birth control and their cycles come back right away and everything is kind of just moving along. And I would say that if you didn't really have any cycle issues and you were not put on the pill for irregular cycles, you weren't put on it for a problem. So, if your cycles were just humming along pretty consistent, like you can't really remember anything off about them, then you'd be more likely to come off the pill and just see a normal resumption of your cycling. For women who did have an issue, like your cycles were super regular, you didn't know when your next period was coming, it's just important to know, since the pill isn't actually solving the underlying issues, it may take a little bit longer for your periods to come back or not, but it's just important to kind of know that. So some women come off the pill, they get their, periods, they ovulate within 14 days and they get their period right away. And some women, it takes them like a month or two, some women, it takes 3 to 4 months. And then I would say it's not, really typical, but there is a small percentage of women who do come off hormonal contraceptives and it takes 6 months or more, and some cases even longer, but that would be more, it's not because of the pill in that situation, it's because more so the pill was masking something. And I mean, with charting, I would say but it's funny because when I started charting, there were no apps, there was no social media, because this was like circa the year 2000. And so everything was on paper for me. So I actually it didn't even occur to me that women may still want to do it that way. But there are a pretty decent percentage of women that like to do the throwback and chart on paper still.
Yeah, that's awesome. If people want to use apps, do you have any recommendations for any apps to use?
So generally speaking, when you are wanting to actually use fertility awareness, potentially for birth control or for conception, I do recommend looking for an app that allows you to turn off the prediction settings. So pretty much all the apps these days have algorithms and they're programmed with data and information. And so what happens, you put your data in, you put your information in, and then it's going to start to tell you like, okay, you're fertile in these days, and this is when you're going to ovulate. And so those apps and algorithms are not always accurate. And so it can be really confusing and challenging in some cases. And just kind of like if you're trying to chart your cycles and you see something and then the app tells you that you're supposed to see something different, I think especially at the beginning stages, a lot of women kind of get tripped up. So I just say, look for an app that allows you to turn off the prediction settings so that at least you have the option. I know some women like to have that, compare the app to what's actually going on. It's kind of fun. It's like a game, but it's nice to have the ability to shut that off. So, I mean, I think some of the most popular apps, I'm not always up to date with all of them, but I know there's a new app, Read Your Body. Kindara was pretty popular, and still is pretty popular. And, there's several other apps, but I would say just one that gives you the option of putting in your data and interpreting it yourself.
Yeah, that's a great tip. I've used an app for a number of years. I think I've tried a couple of different ones. I'm going to check out the ones you just listed as well. But yeah, they've all always given the predictions. And for me, I've just kind of like, I look at what it's telling me and then I like kind of tune into my own body and check out what's going on. And it is very much like I just got my period yesterday or the day before. And so like I updated in my app and then, it changes all the predictions going forward based on what the cycles have been for the last couple of months. And it was really hard when I started getting my cycle again after losing it because it was really irregular for many years. And so I feel like the app was like, oh, you had like a 28-day cycle here and you had a 30-day cycle and then you had a 35-day cycle. So we'll just like take the median of this for your next cycle. So I definitely hear that from personal experience.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, fortunately there's great apps out there. I know Read Your Body is fairly new and a lot of women are gravitating to it. I would have to, maybe at some point I'll interview one of the ladies or something like that to learn more about it. But from the limited amount that I'm aware of, this was an app that was, I think, crowdfunded or crowdsourced, but the women behind it are really knowledgeable in fertility awareness. So it's designed in a bit of a different way, I guess you could say, than some of the period tracker apps. So it's very friendly for women who are experienced trackers who use different methods. So there's not one fertility awareness method that everyone uses. There are multiple fertility awareness based methods under the umbrella of fertility awareness. And so when you start looking into it, you discover that there are many different organizations that teach fertility awareness in different ways. There are methods that track cervical fluid and basal body temperature, like I was talking about today, the symptothermal method. And there are methods that are cervical fluid only. There are methods that are temperature only. There's tons of apps and there's methods that use urinary hormone metabolites. So they're actually measuring the hormones directly. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. And so anyways, it's like I'm doing an ad for, I'm not affiliated with the Read Your Body, but I guess what I'm saying is like, it's one of the newer options for women who are charting, and it's friendly for the different methods and modes of charting, which is helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that resource. And I know we mentioned your podcast and you briefly mentioned your book, The Fifth Vital Sign. Can you tell people a little bit more about that and then where they can go to find that?
Sure. Thank you. So The Fifth Vital Sign, I wrote the book about 2 years ago. Actually, wow. As we're recording it, it's probably right around the time I released it 2 years ago.
Oh,
so
amazing. Yeah.
I just realized that. So, I mean, the book came out of obviously the need for this information. And so the most common thing I hear from women when I share the information about fertility awareness, is that every woman needs to know this. Like, why don't we know this stuff? And so my book was one of the ways I wanted to contribute to that, so that there was a place where I can, put this information all together. And also, one of the things that I was really jazzed up about with one of those situations of like, well, I'll take Lisa's word for it. So there's over 1,000 cited sources in the book. And so for, because fertility awareness is not necessarily a common, method that all health practitioners are aware of, many women find that when they start charting and they start learning more about their body, that their practitioners aren't necessarily knowledgeable and certainly aren't always open to even hearing about the charts, looking at them, and partly because they're just not trained in reading them. So part of the benefit, I suppose, of having all those citations is that you can feel a bit more confident about it. And if there's something that you want to look into more, you can do that. And I think that's really important as we work towards spreading the word about fertility awareness and really showing, health professionals and women alike that there's a lot of science and research behind it. This is not like making a wish and throwing some bones in a circle. This is legitimately science-backed methods that work when used correctly. And yeah, I think it's a really important option for women to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. And where can people go to learn more about you, get your book, all that good stuff?
I always direct people to the podcast. So if you search Fertility Friday in your favorite podcast player, you'll find it there. My website is fertilityfriday.com. You can get the first chapter of The Fifth Vital Sign for free if you head over there. And yeah, I would. And I'm also on Instagram at Fertility Friday, so I'm often posting some fun and interesting inflammatory content there.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. I could keep you on the phone all day picking your brain about this stuff. I just feel like so passionate about it, and I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. So thank you for this conversation, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Matcha Mornings. To find links mentioned in this episode, show notes, photos, and more, head on over to wanderbarn.com/podcast/matcha-mornings. To be the first to know about brand new episodes of Matcha Mornings, subscribe on your podcast app. If you enjoyed this episode of the show, please leave a review or send me an email at wanderbarn@gmail.com with the subject line Matcha Mornings. To follow along with me, Amanda Kingsmith, you can find me on Instagram at Amanda Kingsmith to learn more about other fun projects I'm working on. To find more great podcasts like this one on topics such as travel, the business of yoga, cryptocurrency, and more, head on over to wanderbarn.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.